Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conservation International's webinar titled Transforming Our Incentive Structures to Build a Nature-Positive World. We are delighted to have you with us today. My name is Elle Lewis, and I'm the Senior Director of Special Events here at Conservation International. Before I introduce our host and moderator today's discussion, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items to ensure that this event runs smoothly. Upon joining, all attendees will be automatically muted, and your camera will be turned off, and it'll stay off during the duration of the session. In the interest of time, we have disabled the chat function, but we hope that this will be the start of future engagements on the importance of financing for biodiversity. If you would like to listen to the webinar in Spanish, please click Interpretation from the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish from the drop-down menu. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to all attendees after the presentation. It is now my honor to introduce our host and moderator, Carlos Correa. Carlos is Colombia's former Minister of the Environment and is currently a Lui-Walton Senior Fellow at Conservation International. Carlos provides strategic counsel to CI's leadership on institutional priorities around topics such as natural climate solutions, ocean conservation at scale, and nature-positive economies through a just and inclusive approach. Thank you so much for leading us today, Carlos.
Well, thank you, Elle. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Thank you very much. Today, we will be discussing the topic of incentives, which is at the heart of the Global Biodiversity Framework's goals. Simply put, incentives can be used to either encourage or discourage certain behaviors or actions, including those relating to the environment. Market-based measures like price controls and subsidies are designed to influence our economic system and human choices. Incentives can be used to promote both responsible behavior as well as encourage destructive actions. Unfortunately, our policymakers too often choose the latter. Collectively, we spend at least $1.8 trillion on environmentally harmful subsidies, totaling nearly 2% of our global GDP. Eliminating harmful subsidies and perverse incentives, driving biodiversity loss and fueling the climate crisis and replacing them with incentives designed for a livable planet will be key to bridging the annual $700 billion biodiversity finance gap. Overhauling our system that relies on perverse incentives along with scaling up biodiversity finance is not only critical to meeting our international biodiversity targets, but is necessary to reverse our current trajectory and build a nature-positive world. Redirecting these resources to incentivize sustainable practices and scale up positive incentives will benefit nature and people. As parties around the world design their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or NBSAPs, to align with the Global Biodiversity Framework targets in the run-up to this year's COP in my home country of Colombia. It is imperative that we put incentive reform at the top of our respective agendas. It's been 15 months since the adoption of the historic Global Biodiversity Framework, and we need to urgently translate the agreement's ambitious goals into bold collective action. We cannot wait for others to pick up the slack. We must push our respective policymakers to be the ones who lead the way. Transforming our economic system and incentivize structures will be a defining factor in whether we successfully bridge the biodiversity finance gap and build a nature-positive world. We must replace harmful market-based measures with fiscal policies, new markets, and conservation payment systems. To deepen our understanding of how incentives work, I have assembled an all-star panel of experts around the world. Today, we will be hearing from Mariana Bellot, Patricia Zurita, and Katia Karousakis on how we can collectively tackle the highly sensitive but acutely important topic of incentive reform. So now we will start off by hearing from Mariana Bellot. Mariana Bellot is a leader with 20 years of experience working on biodiversity, conservation and finance, protected areas, nature-based solutions, and international negotiation processes. She has extensive experience with global conservation policy. Mariana is currently Senior Technical Advisor for the Biodiversity Finance Initiative with UNDP, supporting countries to mobilize and scale up finance for biodiversity from public, private, and international sources of funding. We are eager to hear from her today on UNDP Biofin's experience working with governments and their methodology for subsidy identification and reform. Mariana, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you, Carlos. Hello, everybody, and I apologize for my voice. It's a bit rusty today, this morning. I'm very happy to be here with you. We know this is a very hot topic. We were all expecting that it would have been a hot topic 10 years ago, but finally we reach a moment, unfortunately, that turning over to really increase our efforts to reduce harmful subsidies is so important. I represent Biofin, which is a global biodiversity finance initiative from UNDP, and we work currently with 41 countries, supporting them in mobilizing resources from all for biodiversity. Our main approach has been following what we call the Biofin methodology, which is it's a methodology that we have developed and edited for the last 10 years because our 10-year anniversary was this year, in assessing and tracking financial flows at the country level, to develop a finance plan and to develop finance solutions to address not only the finance gap, but really increase financial resources for biodiversity. But as we all know, if you don't reduce the harmful subsidies, even though you keep on increasing financial flows, positive financial flows, it's no point in really addressing that unless we work around reducing negative impacts or negative incentives. So Biofin developed what we call the guidelines to assess harmful subsidies, and these guidelines were based on the country's experiences. Some of the countries have been developing and piloting these guidelines, and a few months ago UNDP released the guidelines. I don't know if we could share a slide where I would like to summarize the different steps that we're using to assess the harmful subsidies. So basically, the guidelines are trying to support countries in following a step-by-step approach in assessing, prioritizing, and developing an action plans to address the harmful subsidies. It's a very, as I said, a step-by-step approach. Some of our countries have already used these guidelines. Colombia is one of them that is one of our leaders at the moment in addressing harmful subsidies. They are currently piloting specific reforms, and they have partnered with an agricultural development bank, Finagro, who is very interested in really greening their financial products for agriculture. So this is the guidelines that we would like to share with you, and I can share also the web link for that. It's in our website. We believe is a very practical tool for not only for governments but also for practitioners, non-governmental organizations, to really assess where are these subsidies and try to connect the impact of the subsidies with the origin of the subsidy, if it's fiscal, if it's different types of subsidies that can affect agriculture, fisheries, and forestries, and our ecosystem services. And I pass it back to you, Carlos, and I'll come back later. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mariana. We look forward to learning more about UNDP's Biofin's work in the run-up to Cali this year. I hope you can come to Colombia by the end of the year. Next up, we have Conservation International's Patricia Zurita, Chief Strategy Officer and EVP of Global Programs. She will break down why we at CI are increasingly turning our attention to incentive reform and how the NGO community can help lay the groundwork for a better world. Patricia.
Okay. Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you so much, Mariana, for setting up the scene so clearly, and despite of you feeling not so well, thank you so much for joining. And it's wonderful to be in a panel with all women, I have to say, Carlos. It's fantastic to see the conversation going this way and the commitment that we have to diversity and inclusion. Let me start to where Mariana ended. I mean, it's not about only making sure that we create more ways of getting more funding for nature. We have to see the investments that we are making on subsidies as water that is going down the drain, and unless we actually stop that flow and change it into incentives that can help us really mobilize funding for nature conservation and restoration, we're not going to win, right? It doesn't really matter how creative we become, how many bonds or how many debt swaps or how many alternative financing mechanisms we create. If we don't stop the way that we're using subsidies to destroy nature, we're not going to be able to make a difference. So this is the first message. Subsidies matter. And yes, it has been a complicated political conversation. It has been a complicated matter, something that we have been speaking about for quite some time, as Mariana said, and it looks like finally we're getting traction. And we're really delighted that by the Global Biodiversity Framework, the countries that were signing the agreement decided that they were going to commit to map the subsidies in their country so we can start changing them. This is the opportunity to take stock on that and look into Cali and the COP in Colombia as an opportunity to really start mobilizing and creating this momentum that is necessary for changing the subsidies into incentives that can help us restore and conserve nature. But let me take a step back and let's get some numbers on the table here. So I think people are familiar with the mapping of the financial gap that biodiversity has. That was reported in the very good document that the Paulson Institute and the Nature Conservancy published in 2020. At that point, we were saying that between $700 and $900 billion were needed for nature, and possibly we could get between 140 and maybe even as high as possibly 500 billion from alternative and creative ways of financing nature. But all of those are things that we have to prove in the market, right? The big gap that we have in that report and that is very clearly spelled out is this 500 billion that could be up to 1.3 trillion dollars that are going into subsidies for production and that are in the process not really considering the value that nature has, and by that we're ending up with deforestation, overfishing, destruction of ecosystems that are the very important thread and foundation of our economy and our life. So that's precisely why CI has been looking into how can we tackle this situation. And it is not necessarily about just coming and demonizing subsidies. We know that subsidies play an important role and in many cases as an economic safety net for local communities and sometimes for the poorest of the poor. What we need to do is look carefully about how can we transform these subsidies into incentives that can help us really restore nature. So let me go into a couple of examples that can really help us start moving this forward. Two different examples. On one hand, we have the agricultural sector in New Zealand for just to share some numbers. Agriculture and livestock are absolutely vital for the economy of New Zealand, as we know. In the 80s, 40% of the sector, 40% of the sector's income came from subsidies. And unfortunately, and it was very clear that those subsidies were reducing competitiveness in the global market and creating very harmful effects, not only to the economy, but also to the environment. Soil degradation was happening. There was excessive use of pesticides and accelerated loss of the ecosystems that were being used for agriculture and livestock. So the national government very boldly decided to cut the subsidies, and land values decreased, leading to a significant amount of uncertainty. However, the transition and the adaptation plan to this new economic landscape allowed for the development of a productive and innovative agricultural sector that is thriving right now. Right now, New Zealand has one of the best agricultural sectors in the world. It's sustainable. It has identified and developed sustainable practices that are now being replicated in other parts of the world, particularly in the dairy sector. And Katia can testify this because this comes from OECD. The level of support to agricultural producers has been reduced to less than 1%. So it has actually, over the last decade, demonstrated that subsidies can actually be reformed and we can create new ways of more sustainably produce our food and fish. We have heard recently that the WTO, for example, is working on or signed in June 2022 on the agreement on fisheries subsidies that was adopted at the 12th Ministerial Conference. So the conversation on subsidies is happening, and there are some demonstrations that are and cases that are demonstrating that this is actually not impossible, as we were talking about a couple of years ago. It is actually possible and is demonstrating that it's not going to completely collapse the economy. On the contrary, it actually helps us incentivize new practices that can help us move things forward. So what is the role of the civil society sector here? I would say a couple of important elements. Number one, we're very happy to embark on testing and identifying ways of reversing these subsidies and creating them to become incentives that can really move biodiversity conservation and restoration in the right way. We have tested that already. CI embarked in an initiative back in the late 2000s when we created with the government of Ecuador, my home country, the Sociobosque, that it was an incentive program to enable local landowners to protect their forest and to really receive, compensation because they were providing a service to the country and to the world. That program has evolved, and now, in addition to forests, they have socio-manglar, so mangroves, they have socio-paramos, so the highland wetlands that are actually providing water to cities like Quito, and it has helped protect and reduce the deforestation rate of Ecuador that was, in the double digits back in the early 2000s. So we know that this is a possibility, and organizations like CI and our collaborators like the Nature Conservancy and many others, we can work on this together and identify ways of creating schemes that can help us test and pilot these subsidies changes into incentives, and then hopefully with the support of the Global Environment Facility and others, scale them up. So our role is to help and understand the impact and partner with others like Biofin and OECD and others who have a lot more of the economics information to make sure that the piloting of these processes are on one hand not going to affect people, because we're very, very careful. We want to be very careful about that. But at the same time, that help us create a new economy that, like we saw in New Zealand, for example, it will generate as much, if not more, income with a more sustainable system that is going to maintain this foundation that is nature that we all depend on. I mean, remember that more than 50% of the GDP depends on nature. So unless we actually start changing these systems that are destroying nature, we're basically, destroying our own future. And by creating these incentives, we could be generating jobs, we could be generating additional economic flows that can help not only protect and restore nature, but also ensure that these economies are sustained in the long run.
Well, thank you, Patricia. Brilliant. I look forward to collaborating with you on all of the great work Conservation International is doing in regard to incentives and subsidies. And definitely Ecuador is doing a great job, and your country, and not only in the fight against deforestation, but also in oceans, in all that blue economy, with that protected areas in Galapagos and the Pacific corridor. So now moving forward, we have Katia Karousakis from OECD. Katia currently serves as the Biodiversity Program Leader for the Climate, Biodiversity and Water Division of the Environmental Directorate. She's co-authored several papers on incentives, including a 2022 report on identifying and assessing subsidies and other incentives harmful to biodiversity. The floor is yours, Katia, and thank you very much to be here to discuss OECD guidance and best practices on biodiversity positive incentives and subsidy reform. Please, Katia, welcome.
Thank you so much, Carlos, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and also a warm thank you to Conservation International for the invitation to be part of this webinar today. As Carlos said, my name is Katia Karousakis. I'm the Biodiversity Program Lead in this division in the Environment Directorate. And just to start off with, I would just like to say a little bit for anyone who might not know the OECD very well and what we do. We've been working on these types of issues for more than 20 years, covering agriculture, fisheries, fossil fuels, biodiversity. We have different directorates. We work with our member countries through different committees to try and develop good practice, insights, best practice for policy design, etc. And we also, at the OECD, through our national governments, we collect a lot of data on a number of different issues. So, and we use that to develop evidence-based policy analysis to try and drive more efficient and effective policies, including for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And in particular, the biodiversity work, I will say, has also been supporting the Convention on Biological Diversity for nearly 20 years now. I want to very quickly point out that Target 18 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has, I would say, 3 elements. The first is to identify the harmful subsidies and other incentives to biodiversity by 2025, then to reform them by 2030, including the most harmful, the 500 billion. And the third element in Target 18 is to also scale up the positive incentives, so the biodiversity positive incentives for biodiversity. And I think it's very important to also think about this as a full package with these 2 different timelines, if you like, the 2025 to identify the harmful subsidies, and then 2030 to both reform and scale up positive incentives. And in this context, parties to the CBD were actually asked to identify their harmful subsidies even before the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. I think it was a COP16, an earlier COP decision in 2016, where countries had been asked to identify their harmful subsidies and other incentives. And in the lead up to COP15, we released a paper that Carlos mentioned on identifying and assessing incentives, including subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity at the national level. So what we did is we identified we looked for all the national level studies that had already been undertaken to identify these harmful incentives and subsidies. We found 23 national level studies across 12 countries and 2 regions, in Italy, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and a number of other countries. And we went through in a sort of detailed manner the approaches they took, the sectors they covered, how they went about identifying these harmful incentives. From the 23 studies, 8 focused specifically on biodiversity, with the others looking more broadly at environmentally harmful subsidies and incentives. And through that, building on the insights and the approaches developed through those national level studies and also the broader literature, we developed sort of good practice insights for any other country that wishes to do a similar national level assessment. And in that approach, we've identified 4 steps to identify and assess these harmful incentives. This paper doesn't go into then how to reform them. We have other work that has done that, including a publication we released in 2017, which is called The Political Economy of Biodiversity Policy Reform. And in that work, again, we looked at effective policy reform, identifying good practice examples, and we tried to extract first, we tried to identify what were the key barriers in implementing effective reform in general, and then how these specific case studies tried to overcome them. And their insights such as putting together a good evidence base, trying to build alliances between economic and environmental interests, because in most cases, the reforms don't necessarily happen for the environmental reasons, but because there's some other economic interests that enable you to unblock sort of the stalemate, along with other, we had six key insights for how to overcome barriers to effective policy reform. I will say the OECD has a number of data sets through our different committees. We track government support to agriculture, government support to fisheries, to fossil fuels, to industry. This data is all publicly available on our websites. It's tracked on a regular basis. So we get updated numbers on a regular basis, in other words. And there's been quite interesting work in the context of fisheries, for example, in a recent OECD review of fisheries that was released in 2022. They've developed a framework to identify what elements of fishery support can be high risk in terms of sustainable fishing versus medium, low, or no risk. So it's developing frameworks to identify what fraction of total government support can be high risk for sustainability, and other similar work undergoing in other parts of the OECD. I also would like to highlight a little bit sort of the other side of the coin, which is the positive incentives and the need to scale up positive incentives for biodiversity. In this context, we've also been doing a lot of work at the OECD on how to design effective taxes on pollution, payments for ecosystem services, biodiversity offset programs, the environmentally motivated subsidies, so the good ones, if you like, if you want to sort of put them in categories. And we also have a database at the OECD called Policy Instruments for the Environment, to which about 130 countries are contributing data to, and they provide information on the policies that are in place. They're mainly economic instrument policies, taxes, fees and charges, tradable permits, etc., all labeled by what environmental domain they're relevant to, including biodiversity. So through that, what we do, one of the things we do in our biodiversity sort of team is we update regularly our analysis on tracking economic instruments and the finance that they mobilize for biodiversity, because most of these types of economic incentive approaches also generate revenue and can also be earmarked for biodiversity. As I mentioned, they include payments for ecosystem services, taxes on pollution that have adverse effect on biodiversity. And if you, for example, in some countries, they earmark those tax revenues and then they reinvest them for biodiversity, further biodiversity positive gains. I will conclude by emphasizing that I think it's also incredibly important that we scale up these biodiversity positive incentives. There's a lot of talk about the 700 billion finance gap for biodiversity. But in our world of increasing population, increasing demand, production, consumption, which we also need to adjust, of course, and these economic incentives help to do that. But the business as usual projection is going to be continued environmental and biodiversity degradation. And it's these types of positive incentives, these economic incentives, that can reflect the negative externalities, put the correct price. So we're reflecting the true value of biodiversity in our economic decision-making, and can bend this curve of biodiversity loss, if you like. And if we also don't put these positive incentives in place, this biodiversity finance gap with population growth, with increasing demand for food, it's just going to continue growing. So we need, as Carlos said in the very beginning, we need these transformational shifts, both reforming the harmful subsidies and the incentives. I will also say that a lot of these numbers are coming out on the value of the harmful subsidies, but they also include market price support. So that's not all total finance that you can just move and shift somewhere else. Some of it is also market price support, so it's more policy measures. And then again, as I said on the other side, we really need to scale up these biodiversity positive incentives so that we can use these two tools and bend the curve of biodiversity loss. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katia. It's exciting to see how OECD lead the way on this critical issue. And definitely you are doing a great job. Thank you very much. We have to do this together, as you just said. And you are doing a great job also in plastics and chemicals. I had the opportunity to work with many of you in 2021 and 2022. So thank you very much, Katia. Now let's invite all three of our amazing panelists back up to discuss incentive reform more in depth. I'd like to kick off our panel discussion with a question for Mariana. In a recent Biofin publication you co-authored, The Nature of Subsidies, you provide specific guidelines for identifying and repurposing harmful subsidies. So Mariana, how can your methodology be applied to governments developing their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or NBSAPs, please?
Thank you, Carlos. That's my voice. Is it okay? Can you hear me?
It's perfect.
Okay.
It's perfect, Mariana.
Okay. So it's a very good question, because every country now, Carlos, is updating their NBSAPs, right? We know that. And if we track or assess the previous NBSAPs, most of them focused on increasing conservation actions and sustainable use, but few of them really were trying to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss. And that's where part of the incentive agenda is embedded. One of the things that we're doing through Biofin, and hopefully countries will be able to use our guidelines, is when we see the NBSAPs through the finance lenses, we realize that we're not trying to redirect funding for biodiversity. We're just trying to increase, which is fine, as Katia mentioned and Patricia. But understanding where and tracking negative financial flows throughout public budgets is complicated. And Katia knows this very well. So one of the expectations we have, and we're already working with some countries, is that throughout their NBSAP update process, assessing the current incentives, because remember, we're not talking only about subsidies, but different types of incentives, addressing their objectives, their costs, their type, who the beneficiaries of these incentives are, because there's going to be a trade-off. Remember, and Patricia mentioned this as well. We cannot just say, oh, we need to decrease negative incentives, because there's going to be a trade-off. So really understanding following the GBF and how MBSAPs are being updated at the moment, we need to make sure that countries are using the mainstreaming lenses to really understand where are they spending the money now and how these funds need to be redirected. And I'm going to say a final message, Carlos, with the experience of your own country in Colombia. Colombia was one of the first countries piloting these guidelines. And it was very interesting to see, and this is not a surprise for everybody, that if you assess or you go into the field trying to assess why a certain region has been deforested, let's say, it's not necessarily related to just one incentive. It's a mix of things that have been happening throughout the time, a mix of incentive of policies that have been have had this negative consequence or negative impact in biodiversity. So understanding how over time this mix of policies and monetary incentives or subsidies for people, remember, because these are people that are depending on these subsidies, understanding how these financial flows have impacted negatively biodiversity, and then trying to change these incentives and policies is super important for the time we are with MBSAP updating. If we see the same MBSAPs that we had 10 years ago, Carlos, we will not address target 18. We need to really step up on understanding the socioeconomic objectives that the ministries that are beyond biodiversity, beyond environmental ministries. You were the head of your ministry in Colombia, right? But I'm sure you know that the biggest challenge is not how do you make your ministry work better, but also how do you make other ministries align with what you are trying to do with their Ministry of Environment. So really making sure that MBSAPs are not environmental strategies, but are fully integrated strategies with all the ministries involved, putting in their, aligning their policies. And I think Patricia will talk a little bit about that, but we really need MBSAPs to facilitate policy coherence, policy alignment, and financial flows alignment. If we don't get this from MBSAPs, it's going to be very hard. Well,
you're just so right, Mariana. You know, I remember that we created at the government at that time this climate cabinet where all the ministers were just seated with the president. So it was so nice because, you know, all the sectors could understand what we were talking about. So I liked your assessment. So thank you very much. So now let's turn to Patricia. Patricia, why is policy coherence the alignment of policies by government departments and agencies to produce the most effective outcomes, critical to reforming government incentive structures at the pace necessary to meet the GBF targets? Please.
So I want to thank you, Carlos, and Mariana set it up very, very well before. I wanted to go back to something that I said at the beginning. So if we think about this problem as, you know, like a water tank, right? You have that the water in the tank is the amount of money that you have available to actually tackle the biodiversity and the climate crisis. If we have subsidies going down the drain that are actually impacting biodiversity and nature, unless we actually change that tap and block it, we're not going to be able to maintain that amount of resources that are necessary for biodiversity and climate. But when I'm saying funding for and resources for biodiversity and climate, what I'm talking about is really funding the very basis of and the foundation of our economy, right? Because we're not, for whatever reason, when we're thinking about subsidizing or destroying nature, what we're not thinking about is the long run. We're thinking, you know, we have all of the resources in the world, nature can survive. We're not thinking about how detrimental this is being to the very basis of our economy. And if more than 50% of our GDP depends on nature, and we are destroying nature in a matter of, a couple of decades, we're going to have to start paying to restore those resources that are actually helping us survive and produce our food, our clothing, our water, everything that we depend on, and in our industry. So what policy coherence does is basically seals the tank. It helps us make sure that all the different policies are enabling us to have a coherent system of subsidies and incentives that are helping production that looks and favors sustainability, not production that is actually favoring destruction. And part of the problem that the reason why this has happened is that governments are not within their own systems. The different units within the governments are not talking to each other. And you experience this as being a minister of the environment in Colombia, finance, hacienda, production, agriculture, they all think about their own systems in isolation of the whole country. And we are producing and designing policies and legislation that it's not talking to each other. So on one hand, we're favoring, subsidies for fisheries that is going and being treated from the fisheries ministry without really talking about the value and the impact that will have on local communities and on biodiversity with the Ministry of the Environment. So that lack of coherence at the national level has traditionally created all of these different systems that we're seeing right now. So the policy coherence call is basically looking at coming to these countries and using some of these countries as pilots and saying, okay, guys, can we put these policies on the table and make sure that they are talking to each other and not, feeding into each other and destroying each other? If we're really having a commitment to protect and restore our nature, to make sure that we are doing our part to tackle the climate crisis, how can we be subsidizing, fuel or subsidizing oil production, or how can we be subsidizing fertilizer use? Those are the type of things that we have to start looking into a more holistic and connected way. And, it is a problem that has 1,000 ramifications, right? It's not something that is only impacting nature. It has been impacting social development. It has been impacting education. It has been impacting, inclusion and diversity and many other elements. So the minute that you actually start looking into that policy coherence, you get masses of gains and efficiencies that we are not having because these policies are not talking to each other. And in many, many cases, they're going against each other.
Well, you're so right, Patricia. I was just thinking about, that's the biggest challenge. We need political will, policymakers working together, and a lot of education. You said something about education, and we need a lot of education for all the sectors. So now, next, I'd like to hear from Katia. In 2022, you co-authored an OECD report on identifying and assessing subsidies and other incentives harmful to biodiversity. Of all the research and information gathered for this report, what is the top piece of guidance or advice you give stakeholders working to reform perverse incentives? Katia.
So thank you so much for that question. I think I'm gonna try and split my answer in two parts, if you like, because that particular report that we released in 2022 was really about identifying and assessing which ones are the harmful incentives and subsidies. It wasn't about reform. That, like, we kept it first to identify and assess, because that's really, in a sense, what the first part of Target 18 says. So we were really trying to target it to the first step of identifying and assessing the harmful subsidies. And in that regard, there's like 4 steps in order to do that. Scoping, to define the types of subsidies and incentives that you want to examine in general. Like, do you want to examine all of them? A subset, like, what you think are the key ones, and different countries have done this in different ways. Screening, to identify what's actually potentially harmful, because not all subsidies are harmful to the environment. I mean, there are environmentally beneficial subsidies, so it's important to bear that in mind as well. Then data gathering, which is a difficult part. I mean, a lot of these types of subsidies are not direct, they're implicit, so it's not an easy, you know, it's not something you're going to manage to do in like 5 days. It's going to take a while. And finally, then assessing the extent of harm, because you identify the amount of the finance, and then you also have to identify finance and other incentives. As I said, it's also policy measures. Then you have to identify to what extent they do create harm on the environment. And an important part of that, and I'm going to echo commonly with what Mariana and Patricia said, is also stakeholder engagement. So it's not only something that needs to be done by the Ministry of Environment by any means. That needs to be done in a very, sensitive, politically sensitive way as well, working together with all other ministries, all other sectors, as, most sectors obviously have impacts on the environment. I mean, this is just physics, if you like. So the importance of collaboration and detail as well, accuracy is important, and to be very specific and accurate and robust in this process. Now to the second part, when it comes to reforming, again, there's a strong need for collaboration and, discussions with your other counterparts. I mean, why do agricultural subsidies exist in the first place? They're not there to create environmental harm. They're there to serve other objectives, right? So it's not black and white. So you need to understand why these other types of incentives are in place and how maybe you can adjust them so that they're, instead of, unintentionally creating environmental harm, how can you adjust them and design them in more effective ways so that you're maybe ensuring, even environmental benefits? But you're doing, I mean, the initial reason why these types of incentives are in place, if it's agriculture, forestry, like whatever, they're there for other reasons, and we need to have a very clear understanding of what they're there for and if there are better ways to address those objectives. Another thing that I think is important is to have as much robust information as possible. So if you do reform, what are your options for reform? What are the likely implications of this reform, not only on the environment, but on your economy, on your social network? And how are you going to ensure that you don't have adverse implications to those other areas, which are also obviously important? So there are no quick, fast solutions. Like, you need to be very careful, I think, very thorough, very prepared when you're working through these types of issues. And I do think that education is absolutely important, public awareness. So making sure that your civil society understands what you're trying to do, because you can also have social unrest like you have in different countries when you try and make these things. I mean, it needs to be done in a very thorough, careful, methodical, transparent, in a transparent way. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Katia. Definitely, civil society is very important as a stakeholder too, and education. I insist in education always, because we need to speak the same language. All the stakeholders need to understand and speak the same language. So we have 10 minutes left. So I think maybe we have the time to have one more question for each one of you, 2 minutes for each. And turning back to Mariana, one key point raised in the Nature of Subsidies report is that social and environmental safeguards must be in place to prevent adverse social and environmental impacts resulting from removing or repurposing harmful subsidies. How, Mariana, do we incorporate these safeguards into policy making?
Thank you, Carlos. So the reality is that the lack of having robust screening and monitoring processes to assess negative impacts on biodiversity is a reality. No country, maybe New Zealand, but no country has a strong safeguard system to make sure that every policy will not have unintended effects on biodiversity, right? Not even for climate change. And I was thinking of climate change when you and Patricia were talking about education. It's how long has taken for to sort of educate or build capacity at the national level with government officials to understand what climate change is, right? 10 years, and we're still not there. Biodiversity is now behind trying to policy practitioners and biodiversity experts are trying to bring biodiversity now to the attention of policymakers, of the finance sector, right? And I think one of the low-hanging fruits that we have now, rather than trying to change the largest subsidies in our countries, is building a robust safeguard system so policy makers can easily put in place safeguards to avoid unintended effects on biodiversity. I don't think any government has developed a policy to intentionally harm biodiversity. I don't think that's the reality. But we have had unintended effects. So we need to prevent them, right? And the only way I can think of is understanding what the impacts are and putting in place safeguards frameworks for those policies that are more related to biodiversity. And I obviously think of agriculture, livestock, and fisheries. And I just, one final message, Carlos, before I hand the floor to my colleagues. Let's not forget about the finance sector. You know very well the role that national development banks have in this field. And it's not about incentives from national governments, but it's also how do we bring in the finance sector and development banks, international development banks and national development banks to put in place these kind of safeguards. And they should be also part of the key players in all of this. Thank you.
Definitely, Mariana. There are key players in this equation. So thank you very much. And now, Patricia, I've been eager to hear what would you say. You were talking about civil society, but what would you say to stakeholders who are worried about that subsidy reform would negatively impact smallholder farmers and or artisanal fisher people?
So I want to go back to something that Katia said and Mariana referred to as well. When subsidies were designed, they were not intended necessarily to harm something, right? I mean, they were there because there were social safety nets for people. That was the principle of having subsidies, is making production and resources for production a lot more available to particularly people who didn't have all of the resources. That was the intention. Now, in some cases, those subsidies have completely been diluted or managed in a different way, or the right people is not benefiting from them. And they have been, expanded, increased in ways that hasn't really impacted, or they are not producing the results that we wanted them to produce. They're not helping the poorest of the poor. They're being taken advantage by, powerful groups. I mean, just think about the conversation that Europe has been having about the common agricultural policy, right? But that aside, let's look into the future and how do we tackle this and how do we make it work in a way that is actually going to not impact negatively the more fragile and poorest communities that definitely need these resources. And this is why I think it's incredibly important to, one, remember something that Katia said, is going to take time, but two, be careful about the way that we design this. So you have to place all of the social and environmental safeguards in the process. But I continue to advocate that the more that we can pilot this at smaller scales and prove that it's actually possible, and that you can start maneuvering and cushioning the unwanted impacts to make sure that that doesn't happen, and that we learn from those pilots, the better we're going to be able to scale that up. Now, the challenge is that in some cases, these subsidies are placed at a national level, and you cannot work at the provincial or district levels. That would be the ideal geography to try to test this, right? And this is where the public funding, and Mariana alluded to this, the role of the development banks play an incredibly important role. They are the ones who can help us through the transition. This transition from these subsidies into incentives is not going to be a cheap one, and it's not necessarily going to be a fast one. But provided that we can actually partner with public funding that can help us de-risk these deals, make them be, pave the road, help us get that runway that we need to really prove that the subsidies, the transformation can happen, the more that we're going to be able to make this happen. And we have had conversations with the Inter-American Development Bank, with the Asian Development Bank, when Ajay Banga in the fall meeting of the World Bank was talking about subsidies. The banks are there; they are interested in this. They are looking at how can they play a role. And I think it's an element of bringing all of these actors together to have a conversation, to have the proper safeguards, to remember that it's going to take time, but that is absolutely necessary. And not because it's difficult, we shouldn't be doing it. And that we can actually bring, as I said, that additional injection of funding to transition us off these subsidies into incentives that can truly help us maneuver the changes and the trade-offs that are going to happen because of these changes. We are rectifying the economy, and that's going to take time, and it's going to be painful. But if we can make it less painful through the injection of funding from public donors and public investors like the development banks, then I think it's a lot more possible.
Well, thank you, Patricia. Definitely, we are rectifying the model, and it's a new economic model that we all need to understand. So I think we have one more question. We have 3 minutes left. So let's turn it back over to Katia. Can you point some examples of what OECD countries have done over the years to incentivize positive behavior and lead the way for others? Thank you, Katia.
So in terms of positive behavior, I'd like to come back to, we released this work called The Political Economy of Biodiversity Policy Reform in 2017, and covers OECD and non-OECD countries. So it provides an overview of effective policy reform for biodiversity and changes that, had been made in France, in Switzerland, with respect to fishing in Guinea-Bissau, I think, and a number of other countries. So I do want to highlight, as I think Patricia and both Mariana pointed below, there are good practice examples. There are quite a few, and reform is taking place across a number of countries. It's maybe not as fast as is needed, but there are insights and lessons to be drawn from the changes that are being made. And in terms of the scaling up biodiversity positive incentives, there are examples of, Ecuador. Patricia was mentioning how the Socio-Bosque program, which was working well, is now being expanded to and scoped up to cover more elements, more types of ecosystems, etc. I think in Colombia, actually, as well, there's a PES program that is being revised to be scaled up. If I'm not mistaken, we're actually going to be looking at Colombia as one case study, but we haven't started fully yet. And a number of others. Again, I think I don't think progress is at the scale that is needed. So I think it's important to convey this message that there is good practice insights. We just need to move faster, stronger, more coordinated, etc. I will say, I mean, because we've been looking for recent examples of positive reform. We're working now on a report on scaling up positive incentives for biodiversity. And one example that has sort of just shot out, like in 10 or 12 countries, suddenly we have plastic bag taxes. In a matter of years, like they've sort of blossomed, these plastic bag, and it's like, oh, great. And you also see the data where the taxes have been implemented and the amount of plastic bags has actually declined by half in certain countries. I mean, it's these small steps that are just, you know, so easy. Bring your own bag. Don't take a plastic bag. Anyway, these are just small examples. And yeah, as I said, I hope we will be organizing a workshop on scaling up positive incentives as part of our work program. And hopefully, you know, at some points, you know, over the next year or so, we'll have another report with good practice insights that maybe others will be interested in reading. Thank you. I'll stop.
Well, thank you very much, Katia. Definitely, we have to be faster. We have to do it faster and stronger, as you just say. And it's a shame that we have run out of time. That wraps it up for today's discussion. I want to thank Mariana, Patricia, and Katia for taking the time to speak with us today. Mariana, the Nature of Subsidies report is truly groundbreaking work, and we are sure it will play a vital role in reforming parties' policymaking going forward. We encourage everyone on the call to take a look at the important work you are doing. Patricia, thank you very much for providing us with concrete examples of how subsidies reform can work while protecting people's livelihoods. Sociobosque is a fascinating case study that has broad implications globally. That's encouraging news on how the WTO can help fight over exploitation in fishing sectors. Katia, thanks for the succinct breakdown of the GBS Target 18 and sharing your wealth of knowledge on the best practices for identifying harmful subsidies. We hope parties to the GBS can use your research for their own national level assessments. Transformational reform is indeed what is needed. And as our friend Carlos Manuel Rodriguez says, there's not a single country today that invests more in protecting nature than it spends on activities that destroy it. This has to change. So the clock to Cali is ticking, and I hope you can come to Colombia by COP16. Thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you.
Gracias a todas.
That was great. Thank you so much. Mejórate, Mariana.
Muchas
Un
gracias,
abrazo.
Patricia.
Mariana,
Gracias.
toma algo caliente. Chao, chao.
Bye,
Great to
bye,
see you,
Katia.
Katia. Stay in touch.
Great to see you. Thank you so much.